prisoners told us yesterday when we were inside they would kill everyone if there was a show of force, all of the hostages, and they would die themselves. And I am absolutely convinced they mean every word of it. And they will also say that they will do nothing to any hostage or in any violent way if the status quo remains. They want to continue to talk. If they go in there, it's going to be a massacre in this prison, and it's on the heads of the authorities if it takes place.
But if we cannot live as people, then we will at least try to die like men.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host Seamus Malakafzeli and our producer M. Saniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying but so far from dead. On the morning of June 25th, 2006, a cell of Palestinian militants emerged from a tunnel into Israeli territory near the Kerem Shalom crossing at the southern end of the Gaza Strip. They advanced on a nearby IDF position, while militants from within Gaza began firing mortars from behind them. Several of the militants came upon a Merkava tank and blew open the back of it with an RPG. 2 soldiers tried to escape and were killed, but a third, 19-year-old Corporal Gilad Shalit, the gunner of the tank, was captured by the militants who returned with him to Gaza.
For those wondering, the Jerusalem Post article from this period does refer to him being kidnapped from his tank. That language will be familiar to those who heard about IDF soldiers being kidnapped from tanks on October 7th.
The operation, which was a joint effort from Hamas and other Palestinian factions, was planned and led by one Mohammed Sinwar, the younger brother of Yahya Sinwar. The younger Sinwar held Shalit in Gaza for 5 years, before Hamas ultimately released him back to Israel in exchange for the release of 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. The most senior political prisoner released was Yahya Sinwar.
This kind of tactic was not an isolate. Palestinian groups have a long history of using this tactic to free political prisoners, with the PFLP in 1970 and, of course, the hostage-taking that occurred on October 7th, with the intent of trading those Israelis for every single Palestinian political prisoner.
But it's not only a Palestinian story. In August 1970, another younger brother attempted a daring abduction and exchange. Jonathan Jackson, age 17, raided a Marin County courtroom, taking the judge, prosecutor, and 3 jurors hostage in an attempt to free his older brother, Black Panther Party Field Marshal George Jackson. And the next year, prisoners at the Attica Correctional Facility in New York rebelled, taking prison guards hostage. In this episode, we'll be exploring what prison, and the concept of the political prisoner, can teach us about the linkages between the national liberation struggles in the US and in Palestine. I remember when I was a student organizer, in particular during the 2014 moment, when there was both the first BLM wave happening here in the US and an Israeli ground invasion of Gaza. I would often recite a chilling statistic. 1/3 of all Palestinian men in the West Bank would be incarcerated at some point in their lives. 1/4 of all Black men in the US would face the same.
What confuses me is when I saw people after the outbreak of the war against Gaza attempting to, on social media, drive stakes through any sort of attempt at Black Palestinian solidarity. Talking about how the Palestinians had never done anything for Black people, for African Americans, for any sort of African American movement. There was no relationship between these two concepts. There was no linkages. There was no need for solidarity. There would be misinterpretations of very old videos about Black Palestinians to imply that there was some sort of like system of segregation against them, that Hamas had specifically oppressed Black people in Gaza, that they were treated akin to gay people in Gaza, which also was a whole different set of lies about throwing them off of roofs. I mean, I think there is a real sense of danger in illuminating these relationships, in the same sense that like illuminating any kind of transnational solidarity is dangerous to these people, which is why the conversation that we have had with Ori Burton, I thought was really wonderful. Like the way in which he is able to speak about the roots of these transnational solidarities, how deeply they were felt, and the vision that they had for the expansion of that solidarity in the future, I thought was really, really shocking and surprising, and also depressing in that we've fallen so far from those visions people had in the 60s and the 70s.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to name the transnational solidarity as itself the threat faced by the establishment. And that was clear in thinking about the repression of the Panthers and other radicals in the late 60s and 70s. But it also persists through today. So it is like absolutely a part of the Democratic Party's messaging and strategy to try and leverage identity groups against one another, and carve out any kind of radical element or anti-imperialism from a kind of weak tea identity-based coalition that they're trying to build. And it's something that I see in my work defending the Palestine Solidarity Movement, right? One thing that I have noticed over years of doing this work is that when Black public figures speak out on behalf of Palestine, they face a wave of suppression and backlash that is totally unparalleled. And one explanation for that is just standard racism, right? People are going to be more likely to be fearful of Black public figures, and they're going to be more comfortable hitting them with a torrent of hate and whatnot. And that's all very real. But I also think it speaks to the particular threat that you're naming, that crossing those geographic divides really it's something that's dangerous. And we see it not just in terms of the repression that Black public intellectuals and Black public figures face, but also massive panic on university campuses anytime you see formations or solidarity being shown between SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine groups, and other affinity groups and other political groups that are built around marginalized identities. And that's been a threat before October 7th, and all of that repression has only heightened since.
I mean, it's not even like outwardly left-wing figures. I mean, I remember what happened with Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is an out and about liberal,
right?
Was heralded as being a symbol of American liberalism in the late 2010s. Excellent writer, but someone who was firmly entrenched within the Democratic Party orbit. And when he finally spoke about Palestine, I mean, this is going back, I think, about a year or so, but I remember him being interviewed, I think, on CBS This Morning. And the host, who coincidentally was someone who had written about getting an adult circumcision.
Oh my God.
As a Jewish convert. If we're talking about that specific type of like, oh, you're like a lunatic. He was questioning Coates, not even questioning, like interrogating Coates about how he could speak this way. He felt that he was qualified to speak this way about Israel.
I imagine if I took your name out of it, took away the awards and the acclaim, took the cover off the book, the publishing house goes away, the content of that section would not be out of place in the backpack of an extremist. And so then I found myself wondering, why does Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I've known for a long time, read his work for a long time, very talented, smart guy, leave out so much? Why leave out that Israel is surrounded by countries that want to eliminate it? Why leave out that Israel deals with terror groups that want to eliminate it? Why not detail anything of the first and the second intifada, the cafe bombings, the bus bombings, the little kids blown to bits? And is it because you just don't believe that Israel, in any condition, has a right to exist?
And then tried to round it up by saying, oh, well, you're still invited to, to the synagogue or whatever, or to the high holiday, sorry. Like, As if he needed that sort of recognition from the pro-Israel crowd to continue living his life.
I mean, I think part of what's happening too is that Zionism wants to claim Jewish identity and to be able to leverage Jewish identity in a particular way. And if you have Black people in the US, other identities, marginalized groups identifying with the Palestinians, that totally negates the ability to leverage the Jewish subject position to advocate for all kinds of things. And like that is like really like the contemporary mode of Zionism that we see is, and that's why the anti-Semitism smear is such a huge part of their propaganda apparatus, because what they want to say is Jews are a historically oppressed people. Therefore, you have to give deference to our political telling of events. And you have to silence or, not express any of these political criticisms because you're negating our experience as Jews. And when you have people correctly recognizing that in the context of Palestine, it's the Palestinians who are being oppressed. It's the Palestinians who have the rightful claim to being an oppressed population in that group, and they are the correct analog to the victims of genocide in the United States. That totally undermines the Zionist position and the Zionist mode of argumentation. I think that's the other side of what explains such a tremendous panic in the face of these kinds of solidarities.
And you can see that panic manifest in the ways in which Israel trots out its own African minorities, with Ethiopians especially. I remember, I think last year, there were Ethiopian IDF soldiers who would publish videos of themselves talking to camera, talking about how people speaking badly about Israel was akin to anti-Black racism, to speaking against the wants and needs of African people. Meanwhile, this is a settler colonial state.
Right.
And this person, even though they are African, is engaging in settler colonialism and is working to benefit a white nationalist state.
The way that Palestinian people and pro-Palestinian people love to use my skin color as an excuse to talk shit about my country. They are so in shock seeing a Black person supporting Israel. Let me tell you something. When I say I stand with Israel, I mean I stand with my right to exist. I stand with my family and my friends. I'm a Jewish woman.
Yeah, I mean, it's frustrating because the identity-based arguments leveraged to defend Zionism are extremely shallow and are basically just meant to deflect away from the kinds of solidarity that we're discussing, which is a solidarity that is rooted in a shared experience of oppression, but also a shared understanding of who and what is committing that oppression, which means getting into the actual history of struggle. Zionists often want to say, like, hey, why can't we be in the 20th century National Liberation Club? Like, aren't we doing self-determination too? And it's like, no, sorry, you don't get to align yourself with the American empire and reproduce its founding genocides and then ask for that kind of inclusion. Internationalism is a real struggle, not a hypothetical one. And that's why I'm so excited to share this conversation we've had with Orisanmi Burton, author of the excellent book, Tip of the Spear. We were able to get into some of those shared histories and real material connections between the Black and Palestinian anti-colonial struggles that are so often overlooked, buried, or even outrightly suppressed.
But before we turn to this conversation, a reminder, this is a free episode, but we're a wholly listener-funded program. That means no ads, no sponsors, and we're dependent on listeners like yourself to keep this show going. If you're able, please consider becoming a paid subscriber to support our work at turbulencepod.substack.com. If you become a supporter for $5 a month, you can get access to news roundup episodes where we will give our more candid takes on the week's headlines, and supporters will have access to monthly live streams and be automatically entered into our book giveaways. We hope you'll join us.
Hello. We have the pleasure of being joined by Orisanmi Burton, the author of the excellent book Tip of the Spear. Ori, welcome to Turbulence.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I'd like to start by asking you about Assata Shakur, who passed away last month in exile in Cuba. You wrote a really beautiful piece about her life in Protean magazine. Who was Assata, and how should we understand her legacy today?
Right on. Assata self-identified as a Black revolutionary prisoner of war. And she not only self-identified in the rhetorical sense, but she actually lived her life in that way in terms of making a tremendous amount of sacrifices for the world that she wanted to build for her children and for the children of others. She was born in New York, raised between North Carolina and New York, became politicized on the campus of City College in New York, joined the Revolutionary Action Movement and the Black Panther Party at a specific time when they were under very intense state repression. And that's something I highlighted in the article in the sense that, she had every reason not to join the organization, right? In terms of that was actually the role of state repression, was to try to dissuade people from doing that. And she did it anyway, right? And so this is the ethical commitment that I'm talking about. And so she worked in the above ground Black Panther Party for about a year between 1970 and 1971. And then state repression forced her to go underground. And so she began to participate in the Black Liberation Army, which was a clandestine revolutionary formation that engaged in a whole variety of criminalized activity. Captured in 1973 in a shootout, put on trial for all kinds of crimes that the state attributed to the BLA, beat all of those charges except for her conviction for the murder of a New Jersey state trooper, which occurred when she was captured, and a shootout ensued in which she was injured, and Zaid Malik Shakur, her comrade in the Black Liberation Army, was also killed. Sundiata Akole of the BLA was there. He was captured after fleeing the scene. She was imprisoned for several years until in 1979, she was liberated by another underground formation associated with the BLA and the Weather Underground. Sekou Odinga participated, Sylvia Baraldini participated, Mtayari Shabaka Sundiata participated, and others broke her out. And she lived underground in the United States for about 3 years until she made her way to Cuba, where she was given political asylum, and she lived out the rest of her life in Cuba, where she continued to write, study, mentor. And so in a lot of ways, it is a tremendous example of someone who lived a principled revolutionary life, who made tremendous sacrifices, suffered a great deal of pain and loss of connection, immediate connection with many of her loved ones, but who died free and who died on her own terms. And so that's a really brief sort of summary of who she was and why she needs to be remembered. And I guess I'll just end with the fact that she named herself Assata, which means she who struggles. And she very much lived up to the name she chose for herself.
Shakur portrayed herself as a fighter for racial justice by what she called armed struggle if necessary.
People have the right to free themselves from oppression by whatever means they deem possible.
I mean, so many of these stories end with, a long chase ending in recapture. I mean, they're killed. They spend God knows how long in prison. You write at the very end, and you talk about how Assata remained free in Cuba, that she died on her own terms. Can you talk a little bit more about if you see power and inspiration in that kind of success, or is it dampened somewhat by how rare such a thing is?
Well, it's interesting. It reminds me of something that actually was in Dylan's article about the Black and Palestinian struggle, which also mentions Assata, right? And you started off by talking about that prison break that happened from a Zionist prison a couple of years ago. I forget the name of the prison.
Gilboa.
Oh, right, Gilboa. And there was that daring subterranean escape, right, that ultimately ended in a recapture. And so I think, the dominant way of narrating that recapture is that, okay, these activities are doomed to fail from the beginning, like they always get caught or this kind of thing, right? But that's actually not how the people who participated in that act thought about it, right? I think the quote that you put in there is something like a minute or 1 day of freedom is worth, a lifetime of captivity. That's obviously a paraphrase, but something to that effect. Similarly, the people who orchestrated Asada's escape, most of them were later captured and served decades in prison for that. Sekou Odinga served decades in prison for that and other things. But he talks about how it was worth it, right? And so I think part of what we have to do is be clear about, the necessity for struggle in service of protecting our collective humanity, right? The struggle itself is part of the liberatory process, and moments of freedom are created through that process. And I think the other thing is, part of the rarity of it comes from our inability or our lack of access to the means of communication and narration, right? And so I remember as a child driving around and seeing in every Black city that I would go to, like a Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue and Malcolm X Boulevard or something like that. But later on, when I started to become more politicized, I started to realize, okay, there's no Robert F. Williams Boulevard, right? There's no Assata Shakur Boulevard, right? And so part of what happens is that when our freedom fighters are captured or killed, that's when a kind of propaganda apparatus takes hold and reshapes the narrative in such a way that makes so-called failures or defeats seem inevitable and normalizes them. And so I think that's why media projects such as this are important, because I think actually there are more sort of stories of resistance than we may realize. And it's our job to tell those stories and to create popular cultural narratives and stories to constantly keep the memories of these things, even if they are relatively rare, to keep those memories alive and circulating.
I didn't think that I would survive. Like I said, I was shot 7 times, and I really thought that it was all over. But somehow I did survive. So for this, I'm grateful, But a lot of brothers didn't make it. And I think about this. And I think about that those brothers, that didn't make it, they cannot be forgotten. They cannot have died in vain. Their deaths must mean something. It must be made known to the people what their deaths meant. You see, what the whole struggle was about. People easy to forget because we're living in a world that's fast moving. Things are happening every day. Things that happened yesterday, today become passé, forgotten about. So I cannot let this die. And I will not let it die in the minds or the hearts of the people.
I should say, just before I hand things off to Dylan, that some of the people who participated in the Gilboa prison break were released in the last prisoner exchange. Someone like Mahmoud Al-Arda had a video in which he talked about having a first meeting with a spoon for the first time in 4 years, the very instrument that he used to break out of prison.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing to is, which I quoted in my piece about the minute of freedom. It's so impacting and it colors how I think of revolutionary action at all, that the forces of revolution are so often aimed at these seemingly intractable structures of domination, and the kind of brief brilliance of revolution can carry far beyond the individual act. The fact that we are still narrating this story of escape speaks to the power of what an act of resistance can mean in a given moment. I'd like to shift gears a bit and talk about your book, Tip of the Spear, which I highly encourage people to read. It is a really tremendous re-narrativization of the Attica Rebellion. And in that book, you argue that the prison system in the United States is best understood as a form of low-intensity warfare that only really pretends to be a mechanism of crime prevention. What does it mean to think about the prison in that way?
Yeah, thank you for that. This was something that I had to learn to take seriously. And it's something that I had to learn that it actually had an empirical basis, right? In other words, I was raised in a political family, and it was very common for me to hear things like, Black people have been at war for 400 years. Like, that's a thing you hear if you travel in certain like Black nationalist circles. And it's like, you hear it, but it's easy to just assume that it's hyperbolic. But for instance, so Assata Shakur talks about it in her autobiography. She talks about how enslaved Africans were captured as prisoners of war, and that prisoner of war status was later used to justify their enslavement, right? Sundiata Acoli, her co-defendant, wrote an essay called A Brief History of the New African Prison Struggle, which starts with European imperialism and the captivity of Africans in the barracoons on the western coast of Africa. That prisoner of war status has never been overturned or challenged or interrupted. So there's a historical argument there. The Black radical critique of prisons and, Palestinian political prisoners make similar arguments also around the actual site of incarceration being really an intensification of an already existing condition of captivity, right? So, the settler colonial project that was imposed upon Palestine as already being a kind of prison. And then captivity within that is a secondary layer of incarceration. Black people made the same arguments. Malcolm X made this argument in 1964. People had done it before him in the Black liberation struggle. So yeah, the prison is a zone of war because life in a settler colony for the colonial subject is war. The prison just intensifies that site of struggle. That's the sort of theoretical framework. But on a broader level, what the war analytic does is it helps us understand that the injustices and inhumanities that are faced by colonized subjects are not some sort of byproduct of like accumulated injustice over time that have carryovers from some earlier moment, right? It's not that the prison system is some vestige of slavery or some vestige of Jim Crow that, that we haven't ameliorated these things. No, it's actually part of an active process, right? Where there is a conflict happening and there are elements of strategy and tactics that are being deployed in order to maintain the subjugation of targeted populations and to facilitate the accumulation of land, accumulation of capital, right? And so the war analytic forces us to think strategically. George Jackson says, we'll never be victorious if we don't realize that we're facing an enemy who is conscious and aware and mercilessly counter-revolutionary. So it's that kind of thinking, that approach to politics as a domain of strategy and tactics where there's no expectation of fairness. That's the other thing, right? It's like we can talk about, international law and these other things, but if you read someone like Karl von Clausewitz, he very clearly says there's no limitations on the conduct of war, period.
Right. I mean, I think what you're bringing up, the ongoing nature of this oppression is a very critical intervention also against legalistic formulations of what the Black struggle ought to look like. One of the major threads, I'm an attorney and I went to law school. And one of the ways that even in a kind of liberal radical posture, I was taught to think about, potential for national liberation in the United States is through this framework of breathing life into the 13th Amendment and the Reconstruction Amendments. And part of the argument there is like a kind of broad reading of what that means to include the badges and incidents of slavery. It's kind of like long tail of the legacy of slavery. And I think that's a potentially useful way of making legal arguments. But also there's a formulation of it that leaves out the ongoing oppression. And I think that the war analytic helps to reorient us. And I do see, and I think that you also spell this out in your work, a kind of opposition to the war analytic and more legalistic modes of thinking about rights and self-determination. And I'm glad that you already started weaving in the kind of Palestinian lineage of thinking in this way, because that was going to be my next question. And you also anticipated where I was going with it, which is this shared settler colonial analytic for understanding these connections. One concept that I keep returning to for myself is this concept of the one state reality. When you hear certain discussions about Palestine and the future of Palestine, it's often framed as this like binary between a two-state solution or a one-state solution as potential, avenues for the realization of self-determination. And the one state reality is this concept that gets brought in as like, well, the peace process has been this kind of perpetual deferment of Palestinian nationhood or statehood or self-determination. And what we are living in the wake of the failure of the peace process is the one state reality, where the reality is that Israel is the hegemonic power, the sovereign over all of the land of historic Palestine. And that, the occupation is just kind of built into the fabric of life. And I have been sitting on this concept that in many ways the United States is really like the long one state reality, that's actually a way of understanding where the United States that national liberation was never achieved. And, to bring it back to George Jackson, that we're still in the midst of this one long war against different peoples. And so I guess my question to you, which you've already answered, but you may want to expand on, is kind of considering that framework, do you see abolition and national liberation as analogous projects or potentially even the same project, like the same mode of struggle?
Wow. Writing Tip of the Spear has changed my thinking around abolition significantly. Firstly, I came to the realization, kind of explicitly that, okay, the concept of prison abolition, first of all, comes into being in this kind of 1970 moment, right? As a result of these broader struggles that are happening, in the United States, operating under the framework not of a civil rights struggle, but as a national liberation struggle broadly, or as a revolutionary or anti-colonial struggle, like that was the banner of it. But it was just one framework circulating amidst a constellation of different ways of thinking about what the liberatory project should look like. So I think over the past, I think October 7th has changed this a little bit. But I think prior to October 7th, it was like abolition was the umbrella term under which all of these diverse, different kind of leftist, contemporary, ostensibly leftist discourses were gathered under. I don't think there was a whole lot of critical discourse that was trying to sort of really understand what was underneath it, right? And I think that has a lot to do with like the academic industrial complex and the politics of knowledge production under that kind of regime. But from what I understand, so like, for me, it's like, okay, what would it mean to locate the origin of abolition with someone like George Jackson, who said, for instance, we have to tear down the prison from the inside, and we have to abolish the function of the prison as a concentration camp. So he said prisons in the US, prisons in Vietnam, and prisons in other sites of anti-colonial resistance are performing a concentration camp function. And we have to abolish that function. So he's saying we have to abolish the function of the prison as an instrument for neutralizing revolutionary activity. But he's not saying we have to do away with all prisons, right? Why? Because, again, this is why the war analytic is important. If you understand yourself to be at war, then you understand that you have enemies, and you understand that those enemies are not going to willingly allow you to take power from them. So those enemies are going to have to be neutralized somehow, because that's what happens in war. And so that was a really transformative realization for me, because I think that genealogy, I call it the revolutionary genealogy of abolition, has largely been overshadowed by a kind of more liberal, idealistic notion of abolition that doesn't really ask questions about political violence, and I don't think are up to the task for helping us understand how we might navigate a moment like this, where it's very clear that we're dealing with fascists who don't recognize the shared humanity of the human community, let's say. So how do you deal with people like that? Question mark.
All this talk about the inadvertent solidarity that exists between third world communities. I'm curious, there's this amazing anecdote that you detailed in your talk from Attica to Gaza about the idea that the revolutionary Martin Sostra had that reminded me a lot of prisoner exchanges like the Shallot deal, like the PFLP exchanges in the 60s, where he suggested that the prison movement find a way to forge alliances across the third world so that, for example, an Egyptian officer could be exchanged for an imprisoned Black revolutionary in Oakland, for example. Can you go into detail about what came of ideas like these? Why did this not become as possible as it was able to be in places like Palestine in regards to its occupation?
Yeah, no, this is fascinating. So Martin Sostra, political prisoner during the 1960s and into the 1970s, Afro-Puerto Rican revolutionary member of the Republic of New Africa, transitions into more anarchistic politics. By all accounts, just a brilliant, incisive thinker, writer, self-taught lawyer, voracious reader, was very closely following international politics from his prison cell and was thinking about and he's one of the people who's thinking about the prison as a site of war, right? He's using law, but it's lawfare. He's using law as a tool, one among many, but he's also thinking about how to leverage political violence, but how to leverage it from a position of profound asymmetry. And so on the one hand, the sort of mini manual of urban guerrilla warfare is published in 1969 by Carlos Margella, who's outlining the tactics of resistance to the US-backed fascist regime in Brazil. And one of the things he talks about there is prisoner exchanges is one tactic that can be used. And so this document circulates widely in the US. It's read by the BLA and others. And then the other thing that happened, I think a year earlier, was a massive prison exchange. I think it was the first between the PLO and Israel, where they hijacked a plane en route to Tel Aviv and diverted it to Algiers. And there was a sort of long, drawn-out process that resulted in a prisoner exchange. And so Sostra reads about this and also reads about another prison exchange that happens in the Dominican Republic. And he starts to think about, okay, well, this is what we need to be doing. We need to have a international, transnational resistance pact where our allied movements can exchange their captives for our captives in other places. So it's this very sophisticated idea that, of course, would, there need to be a high level of organization that I don't think was fully developed. What I think is important about all of this is that I situate this conversation with Sostra as the backdrop to Jonathan Jackson's raid on the Marin County Courthouse in August of 1970, where Jonathan Jackson, George Jackson's younger brother, takes hostages in the Marin County Courthouse in California with the goal of exchanging those hostages, which included a judge and I think a DA, for his older brother. And then the plan, I believe, was to fly to Algiers. So it was a very audacious plan. For various reasons, state officials had foreknowledge of the plan, and it appears as though they allowed it to happen so that they could engage them in a shootout and take out as many people as possible. So that didn't materialize. But I think that was the context in which a move like that seemed possible because it was happening elsewhere, right? The other thing that's important to understand is that, I talk about Attica as this long, distended thing that takes place. It unfolds over a year across multiple jails and prisons and different carceral sites. the opening carceral site that inaugurates the Long Attica Rebellion is in the Tombs, which is a jail in New York City. And that happens on August 10th, 1970. And they take hostages and make demands. Well, a couple of days earlier, the Tupamaros of Uruguay had captured a hostage, Daniel Mitrione, who was working on behalf of the CIA teaching torture techniques to the regime in Uruguay. And they captured him and tried to exchange him for 150 Tupamaro political prisoners. Those prisoners were never released, so the Tupamaros executed Mitrione. So if you look in the newspapers at the time for the Tombs Rebellion, on one page they're talking about the Tombs Rebellion, on the other page they're talking about the killing of Mitrione. And I just think people should keep all of this in mind as they're reading George Jackson, because if you read George, he constantly talks about the Tupamaros. So there's a transnational conversation that's happening indirectly through publications, through the propaganda of the deed, where these different actors are trying to experiment with how to develop the political leverage to build some power in this asymmetrical zone of warfare. So I think it doesn't really answer your question as to why it didn't develop to the extent that it did in other places. They were having conversations about international prison exchanges in the Attica Yard. I have a piece of FBI surveillance where they're talking about how to use the hostages in Attica to leverage the release of other political prisoners. The last thing I'll say that I just reminded myself of is that Nelson Rockefeller, this is actually, I think part of the answer is the massacre in Attica was an answer to the question of can we use hostages for political leverage. So in response to the Attica Rebellion, Nelson Rockefeller killed 39 people, including 10 of his own prison guards. And then he tortured hundreds of, or he oversaw or allowed the torture of hundreds of other people for an extended period of time. And when asked why he did that, he brought up prisoner exchanges that had happened elsewhere in the world and said that we had to, that this was a civilizational threat, right? And so I think part of what happened was that a message was sent in a very clear fashion that this strategy won't work. That is the message that a lot of people took from Attica explicitly. I've talked to people who were in that struggle who have said things to me, and there's a quote in the book where one person said, look, we learned that we wouldn't be able to get far by taking hostages, so they changed their strategy. So I think that's part of the answer.
I mean, you're speaking a lot about how those incarcerated saw transnational connections. But I'm curious in regards to one arena in particular with the Palestinian cause, how the Palestinians themselves saw it. I mean, in the 60s and the 70s, when Attica occurred, when all these different events were transpiring, were Palestinian organizations forging these connections on their own independently, or was that something that came later?
Yeah, this is one of the areas that I want to know more about, right? So much of what we know on the question of solidarity is going in one direction during this period. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that I don't read Arabic. And I think some of it actually is in some of the Hebrew newspapers too. I don't read Hebrew either. So I've encountered some documents that may speak to this more. I do know that a few weeks after the Attica Rebellion, there was a rebellion in Ashkelon prison. I think it was September 30th, 1971. And hostages were taken. And, like they do in prisons in the United States, in response, all communications were shut down. So we don't get to hear directly from the people who participated. But one of the lawyers wrote a sort of summary of what happened. And then we know that one of the prison administrators, a guy by the name of Ari Ner, who was the commissioner of the Israeli prison system at the time, said in response to the media that the captives in Ashkelon had encountered a newspaper that gave an accounting of the Attica Rebellion, and this was the inspiration for their rebellion. And so I think that that's really interesting, but it's also dangerous because prison officials in the US do this as well, right? It's supposed to give this impression that some outside stimulus, like these people couldn't have, like they had no other reason to rebel. Like they had to see this other thing and then they were like, oh, let's try that, right? So on the one hand, I take it with a grain of salt. On the other hand, it's quite likely that they did hear about Attica. But what it definitely demonstrates is that NER and the IPS understood that these things were connected, right? So regardless of whether or not he's telling the truth, the connection there is that these are two sites of resistance within a settler colonial context, and that they understand the fragility of their own carceral regime in both of these spaces, and that they understand that these things are connected. And so that, I think, is extremely important.
You know, we talk about flashes of revolutionary brilliance, right? And I think that this period in time is one of those special moments where those connections are being forged. And I think it's worth bringing in the historical context to help potentially explain why and how that was happening, right? Like on the Arab side or on the Palestinian side, you have the Naksa in 1967, right? This massive setback where the ideological power and galvanizing force of pan-Arabism as a concept takes this huge step back. And what you see is a new type of left internationalism emerging on the Palestinian scene. So you have the self-declaration of the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a new cohort of revolutionaries that are grounding themselves and their strategy, not just in the regional Arab nation, but a kind of anti-imperialist internationalism. And they start identifying themselves as in joint struggle with the Vietnamese, who also, you have the US war on Vietnam at the same time. And they also do identify themselves with the struggle of Black Americans in the United States. And to me, like that is like such a critical backdrop for thinking about the tactical innovation that we're seeing and the connections between them, right? We have, like, as you mentioned, that hijacking in 68 that Leila Khaled participated in, and this kind of feedback of revolutionary energy and anti-imperialist ideology kind of between the prison struggle in the United States and in Palestine. And, you know, one of the things that you write about in Tip of the Spear too is the broad internationalist demands that the Attica revolutionaries make, you know, demanding to be granted extradition or passage to third world countries. And I think that, like, part of what we're getting at, right, the fears of the IPS, the prison guards in Palestine, and the fears of New York State and the American forces of repression are, I think, related to this kind of new emergent form of internationalism and the threat that poses. And it caused massive backlash in both arenas. And, you know, the years since have been extremely devastating. One thing that we've seen in the United States since 1967 in particular is the state criminalizing the very act of solidarity, right? So one thing we see, you know, in US law is the introduction of the category of the terrorist. And that is built around the Palestinian. And there's kind of a long story to be told about how that happened. And it involved Zionist organizations like the ADL, which also were engaging in the surveillance of and infiltration of anti-racist organizing happening in the United States, like NAACP and others. But they're leaning on the U.S. government to to effectively criminalize any kind of association with members of the PLO, right? And that showed up in immigration law. It showed up in, the first, this is a digression but the first mention even of terrorism in a congressional statute is a ban on the delivery of aid funding to Palestinian refugees, right? Anyone who has received any kind of militant training, that is like the first introduction of the concept of terrorist and how it's defined in the US code. And what we've seen since, right, is the introduction of more legislation that really went into hyperdrive in the post 9/11 period. trying to make it illegal to engage in any kind of material support or solidarity with revolutionary groups and actors in Palestine. I think this speaks to the threat that solidarity poses, but it also speaks to the very difficult terrain we're in now. So I guess my question is, in the context of that, what forms of solidarity, of transnational solidarity, have survived from that era?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I wanted to say a few more things about that 1967 moment, because I think it's really important. So just another development, 1967 is the year that COINTELPRO is revitalized. And I don't think people have grappled enough with the extent to which the idea of anti-Semitism was weaponized by the FBI to try to delegitimize movements in the US and specifically solidarity with Palestine, right? So I have a number of FBI files which speak to that fact. 1967 was also the year that the CIA launches Operation Chaos, which was about a lot of things, but one of those things was specifically around severing international solidarity between movements, right? 1967 was also the year that the US started sending technical advisors working undercover, for the CIA to Vietnam to help transform the prison system in Vietnam. And so some of the demands from Attica were later circulating in prisons in Vietnam, which is another just mind-blowing fact, right? But the person who was tapped to sort of transform prisons in South Vietnam into instruments of counterinsurgency, his name was Donald Bordenkircher, who used to work in the California prison system. So he was responsible for sort of managing the BGF and George Jackson. And then they send him to Vietnam. Then he comes back to the United States. Then years later, he's sent to Iraq to manage the fallout from the torture scandal in Abu Ghraib. This is all the same person, right? So there's a kind of when we talk, unfortunately, the internationalism that is the strongest is this fascist internationalism that George Jackson talks about, right? So these people are thinking very transnationally, and they're empowered to move across borders and different scales of state formation with relative ease. But I do think, to answer your question, I do think we are seeing, the kind of revolutionary internationalism remains alive, but it's incipient, right? So, the one thing that comes to mind right now, and this is again, a relatively minor example, but it goes back to what we were saying in terms of, we didn't use this word, but I think thinking about the prefigurative, thinking about the different seeds that are planted, thinking about the ways in which people who have extremely constrained amounts of power, autonomy, and agency are trying to reach across borders, right? Despite opposition. So I think about, I think his name is Qadir Adnan, who was a former Palestinian political prisoner who expressed solidarity for the hunger strikers in the Pelican Bay prison system in California, who were in long-term solitary confinement. And they were members of rival gang factions who subordinated their own internal contradictions and subverted this architecture of solitary confinement by communicating with each other through the plumbing in the toilets, right? They learned that if they flushed the toilets, they could talk to each other through the drain pipes, and managed to organize a collective hunger strike in 2013, which was simultaneous to a hunger strike that was happening in Palestine at the time. And Adnan expressed outward solidarity with the Pelican Bay hunger strikers. He said, this is a quote, "Solitary confinement is a mechanism of torture from Palestine to Pelican Bay to Guantanamo, and we stand in solidarity with the courageous prisoners who challenge isolation and oppression." We could also think about, I think The brother's name was Hamza, a recently released incarcerated person in the California prison system who donated his extremely meager commissary, which he accumulated through several hours of imprisoned labor. He donated it to relief efforts in Gaza. You know what I mean? So these seemingly little gestures of solidarity speak to the ongoingness of a transnational consciousness that really needs to be materialized through, a kind of durable infrastructure that is being built, is also being attacked, but needs to continually be nourished.
You're mentioning Khadr Adnan, and his life to me is really fascinating, and in particular, what occurred after his death. He talked a lot about what he called snatching livelihood by the empty intestine.
الكرامة لا تشترى ولا تباع بل تنتزع انتزاعا بأمعاء الخاوية.
And towards the end of his life, he really attempted to revitalize the hunger strike movement among Palestinian prisoners. And in the course of that attempt to revitalize it, he died 87 days into a hunger strike. What made that death so different from other deaths, at least to me, was that the Israeli prison service and the other ministries did not fear the retaliation that would have come from that. When Palestinian Islamic Jihad retaliated with rockets, it was welcomed. And prison conditions after that under Ben Gvir have become so abominable that there doesn't seem to be any real way for Palestinians to organize in the way that they had in the past. I mean, there are these videos in which they're literally strapped to each other on the floor. They can't move, and it's broadcast on Israeli TV as a form of deterrence. I mean, with these conditions that are continuously worsening in both Israel and in America in these ICE facilities, how does the prison movement respond to those sorts of complete restrictions, such a lack of care at the idea that they are hated by the public?
Yeah, that first video of people being sort of consumed by, I forget the name of the prison in, is it Ecuador? But the Trump regime produced a very high quality video that was then circulated of people being incarcerated in these detention facilities.
In El Salvador?
Yeah, El Salvador. Did I say Ecuador? I meant to say El Salvador. Yeah. Do you remember that video? I remember watching the video and saying, wow, they used drone footage. They had a Steadicam operator. They had lighting, and they were using boom microphones. Like, this was a high production value project designed around promoting the spectacle of these people being caged and incarcerated, right? So that showed me that permanently,
like no possibility of them being released. They were there to die in there.
And it just was really clear to me that they wanted us to see this. They knew how enraged we would be. They produced this as a spectacle, knowing that it would enrage the population, and did it anyway. So that to me is a real powerful indication of the political moment we're in which, the sort of consensual aspects of our rule are being dispensed with, and we're being solicited, or solicited even seems too consensual. We're being ushered into or pushed into a sort of like openly authoritarian context. The prison movement, and you read the works of the Palestinian political theorists and political prisoners, they say that same thing. It's inseparable from the movement outside. The politics of these movements reflect each other. Oftentimes you'll see the movements inside taking on a greater degree of militancy, and that, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that many people are incarcerated as prisoners of war, but also because of the conditions that they're subjected to. So in terms of the degree of the movement, it's a difficult question because, in the United States, we started off by talking about Assata Shakur, And, she went underground and was underground in the United States for 4 years. And we still don't know how that was able to happen. Like the people who participated in it, right? So there was an infrastructure that was in place that was able to support her for that period of time. So that is the kind of infrastructure that would be necessary to support any kind of resistance to this current regime, right? She got out of prison because she was liberated from prison. I participate in a lot of, sort of defense campaigns for political prisoners. And in none of those meetings is that level of militance on the table, right? I write letters to parole boards talking about, the extent to which this person has been rehabilitated, because that's the language that we are coerced into using in order to get people released. And so that's just sort of where we are right now in terms of our, actual capacity to get people out and to provide care for them.
I think it's worth acknowledging and naming directly that we still have political prisoners, both political prisoners that have been incarcerated here for decades and new political prisoners that have been taking action. Too many to name, but at least in New York City, I'm thinking of Jackie McRae and Tarek Bezrouk. These are people who, as you're naming, we may not have the infrastructure that existed in a prior revolutionary era to take that kind of meaningful action, but we do have a moral and political obligation to show support for. And to me, it sounded like you were making reference to Palestinian Walid Daqqa and his writing on the prison. And just in thinking about him, the kind of project, the shared solidaristic project that we've been talking about, it seems like one of our obligations, right, is to keep the revolutionary flame alive. And that orientation of survival through longer historical periods of heightened repression feels extremely important. And I'm curious if one thing that's striking about Daqqa is his act of reproductive resistance, right? Of smuggling his sperm out of the prison and actually giving life to his child. I'm curious if you see that as a mode of survival in carrying this revolutionary flame, however feeble it may be at the present moment forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a powerful thing to just sit and contemplate, and it's not entirely dissimilar from what Assata went through, in the sense that she and her comrade, Kamal Siddiqui, who's current political prisoner in the U.S., while they were on trial, they conceived a child. They were intimate. They were separated from the courthouse and, separated from the trial because they were disrupting it and had the privacy and, engaged in a relationship. Before they did that, they had a conversation around, is it ethical to bring a child into this world under these conditions, and decided that, producing new life is part of the resistance. I mean, if you're being faced with the genocidal enemy, what they want is for you to no longer have the capacity to reproduce, right? And so Daqqa is someone who's been very influential to me. I learned about him in 2018 when I had the opportunity to visit the West Bank and gave a lecture on my research. An intergenerational group of people from all across the sort of West Bank came and listened. It was an amazing experience. And they said, you need to read this essay by Walid Daqqa, Consciousness Remolded. And I did, and, really blew my mind. And there's a lot of similarities there between what he was writing about and what someone like Mutulu Shakur wrote about, who was imprisoned in Marion Federal Penitentiary in Illinois. And he wrote about how the war that's being waged in prisons is a war to destroy Black national consciousness. And Daqqa says the same thing in the context of Zionist prisons. They're trying to destroy Palestinian national consciousness. They're trying to transform us into individuals who are only interested in our own individual personal well-being and our own personal gain. And both of them outline all of these techniques, many of them subtle and seductive and not immediately legible as torture, but would actually be recognized as being in alignment with a kind of a human rights framework, but that are actually designed to de-radicalize the population. So it's a very sophisticated argument. And, I think I'm doing some research now on the actual material connections between these techniques that have been developing, historically. But yes, DACA has been very, very influential to me. And that story about, this act of resistance in the sense of bringing new life into the world is just tremendous.
You spoke you've spoken a lot about the prisoner exchanges that have already happened. Talking your talk Attica and Gaza about these prisoner exchanges. I'm curious how you see the prisoner exchanges that have happened between Gaza and the Israelis at multiple times during this war. I mean, thousands of people have been released, but so many of them are not members of the resistance. They're journalists, they're medical personnel. And there are still far more Palestinians imprisoned inside Israeli jails post-October 7th than existed in those jails pre-October 7th. When we're talking about Asada, the fact that someone was able to enjoy freedom at all was considered to be a very joyous thing. But do these events strike you as a kind of welcome reprieve, given the scale of what has happened to these prisoners? I mean, is it too grim to speak of any kind of optimism?
To be honest, it's hard for me to fathom the scale of what's happening. I mean, I'm sure people have seen the report, Welcome to Hell, just outlining the extent of the sadism, institutionalized sadism, that is being inflicted on people. I really don't have a language to articulate how I feel about it. The other thing that's always fascinating about these prisoner exchanges is just the differential value of life is built into the process of the exchange. Like I'm so conflicted by that. On the one hand, I want as many Palestinians as possible to get out. On the other hand, this idea that like one Israeli hostage is worth, fill in the blank Palestinian captives is, I find, grotesque. You know what I mean? But yeah, get as many of them out as possible. I mean, it's hard for me on the sidelines, to make an intervention into how people should be, celebrating or responding to this under these conditions. It's really beyond my capacity to understand. And so I really take my lead, from the thinkers and the activists who are on the ground and just try to pay attention and to approach it with a sense of humility, trying to continue to learn about what's happening and the different dynamics. Like this has all been very much a political education for me, and I think for all of us on different levels. And so that's the most I can kind of say about that.
I think your point about the kind of baked in dehumanization of the exchange formula is really interesting. And I think what makes it effective or useful as a tactic that has persisted for so long, right? It is actually flipping the colonial dehumanization on its head. It's if 500 of us is worth one of you, okay, we'll go out and get one of you. And, that is the logic that I think was in the initial exchanges and the initial hostage operations in terms of the Palestinian Revolution in the late 60s and the early 70s, and I think continued or lived throughout Jonathan Jackson's attempt to free his brother and carried through. I write about this in my piece, Fugitive Solidarities, through to Yahya Sinwar's younger brother, leading the operation that ended up freeing his older brother. And of course, kind of carried through in its logic through October 7th in that operation.
Yeah, that was fascinating. I didn't know about that connection with the younger brother.
I guess I want to end just by asking you about any potential sources of inspiration in the present. I know it's a very grim present, but we are seeing some flashes of renewed energy. There have been coordinated hunger strikes in several prisons. There have been mobilizations, both on the outside and on the inside, with respect to the ICE facilities. In New Jersey, we saw a prison riot and then a subsequent actual escape of detainees from Delaney Hall. Do you take inspiration for a potential new wave emerging from these struggles? And then as like a follow-up, one thing that's interesting about ICE as being a central terrain here is that it, in a way, bridges the national and the international. And that seems relevant at this kind of current conjuncture in the American empire, where the borders have kind of come back home. If we think of the 60s and 70s at a time, the height of American empire, and the frontier had been expanded all the way to the periphery, there is this kind of sense that the borders are coming back home. And I wonder if there is a new type of internationalism that might emerge from that.
I'm raising 3 children right now, 3 young children. That's my primary job, my primary responsibility. And that's actually the primary source of my inspiration, is just in the youth, in young people, and just looking at how activated young people are becoming. Again, I don't have the words, but as grotesque and unthinkable the past 2 years have been, it has had the effect of really, I think, doing away with the veil, and has really exposed liberalism as the handmaiden of fascism. I mean, this is the other thing about war. I mean, genocide is a form of war, right? I mean, there's different kinds of war. Genocidal war is a kind of war. And one of the things about war is that it forces people to choose sides. And so it's becoming easier, a little bit easier to sort of see what side people are on. People are making it clear. And I think, that's why so much effort is being directed towards propagandizing young people, because they see what's happening. And I see it, when I talk to young people and students, and I'm really inspired by it. And I think there's a lot of interest right now in excavating the sort of lessons that we've been talking about. And I'm not one of these people who's hostile to spontaneity. I think it's a necessary part of political struggle. I think it's inevitable. I think that people are going to respond to repression in all of these different ways. But there have been a lot of lessons that have emerged from past cycles of struggle, and we've been discussing many of those lessons. And part of the control apparatus has been to hide those lessons from us, to incarcerate them, to distort them. But I'm meeting more and more young people who are serious and have been studying history for the purpose of actualizing it in the present. And I find that to be tremendously inspirational. And so that's what I want to offer as an answer to that question.
Orisanmi, thank you so much for your time. This has been an incredibly enriching conversation.
Oh, same here. Thank you so much.
What I see is this for the people in the street. I see, wake up. Stop hiding. Stop talking about it don't exist. Stop talking about you don't understand it. Stop talking about that cold water flat you live in is good enough for you. Stop talking about where you in jail and you getting 3 meals a day. Other than that, wake up. Because the same thing is happening to me is happening to you. And deal. Petition. Rallies. Let the people, let the governor, let the president and people that in a position to do something about this know how you feel about your sons and your daughters that's incarcerated. Other than that, wake up, because nothing comes to a sleeper but a dream.